Okay, for a totally different take on distributive justice than John Rawls, we turn to Robert Nozick, who was also a faculty member at Harvard at the same time as Rawls. They died in the same year, 2002, and Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice, came out in 1971. Nozick's big book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, came out 3 years later in 1974. So it's a big Harvard battle between these two guys. Now, if I said that Rawls, his view lines up more with, kind of the moderate left and the American politics, Nozick is a hero of libertarianism. So libertarians out there, this is your boy. Now, here's Nozick's view of distributive justice. He starts off and he says we need to talk about justice in holdings. Now, by justice in holdings, he means justice in what you have. How do we know that the stuff you possess justly? And he says justice in holdings includes two principles: how somebody got it in the first place and how these objects got transferred. In other words, the principle of justice in acquisition. And this principle of justice in acquisition involves how things that nobody holds come to be held. Now, there's got to be some way that that happens justly. Say we discover some new island in the middle of the ocean. Well, nobody presumably owns the coconuts on the island, but there's got to be some just way in which those coconuts, which nobody holds, come to be held by somebody, say me. Okay, so there's some principle, and he doesn't even need to spell out what that principle is. He just says, let's imagine that we were able to identify the principle of justice and acquisition, how coconuts that nobody holds come to be possessed by me. Now, we've also got to come up with a principle of justice in transfer. And this principle describes how things that are held by one person may come to be held by another. So let's say there's some just way in which the coconuts which I have, I can give them to you, or you can acquire them somehow. They can be transferred to you. Maybe you purchase them from me. It doesn't even matter. And there's some way in which objects can be justly transferred from one person to another. Now again, he doesn't spell out what these principles are. He just says, let's imagine that we figure out what they are. There are such principles. Things can be justly acquired and justly transferred. Now, with assuming that there are such principles, that can give us a theory of entitlement. Now, the theory of entitlement is who is entitled to hold the things that they've got. What is it that you're entitled to have? And he says basically we can describe that just by describing who's been following those principles of justice I just described. So a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice and acquisition is entitled to that holding. So if I followed the principle of justice and acquisition when I got those coconuts on the discovered island, well, I'm entitled to the coconuts. Secondly, a person who acquires a holding a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice and transfer from someone else entitled to the holding is entitled to the holding. In other words, if you got the coconuts from me by following the principle of justice and transfer, then you're entitled to those coconuts. Okay? And then thirdly, nobody is entitled to any holding except by applications of principles 1 and 2. So in other words, what are you entitled to? You're entitled to anything that you hold which came to you by following the rules, the principles of justice and acquisition and justice and transfer. And if you didn't get your stuff that way, you're not entitled to it. But if you did, you are entitled to it. Okay, that's actually his theory of distributive justice. It's this theory of entitlement. And but he doesn't like the term distributive justice at all. He says, well, here's his view of it. He says a distribution is just if everyone is entitled to the holdings that they possess under that distribution. And he adds in, we also need a principle to tell us how to rectify injustice in holding. So if you stole my coconuts, we need some principle which tells us what you need to do, how to restore those coconuts to me, maybe with interest or something like that. He doesn't like the term distributive justice, though, because he thinks that it's unhelpful in various ways and prejudices the question towards a view like Rawls's. But here's his big idea. For Nozick, justice in holdings is historical. It depends upon what's actually happened. It depends upon how you got your holdings. It doesn't matter, on Nozick's view, whether you and I have equal coconuts at the end. As long as we both got our coconuts by following the rules, it doesn't matter whether I've got more than you or you've got more than me or there's vast inequality or anything like that. As long as we didn't cheat and steal to get the coconuts, it's a fair, just distribution. Distributive justice has been honored. Now that's quite different than Rawls's view. Rawls's view said, no. What matters is not necessarily how you got your goods. What matters, according to Rawls, is whether or not this distribution maximally benefits the least well off, right? And so what matters is whether things are sorted in the proper proportions. Nozick says there's no right proportions that things should be held in. All that matters is whether you got your stuff the right way. And in fact, he says there's a fundamental incompatibility between freedom and this idea that there's some right proportions that we ought to have in our goods. And he tells this very memorable story to illustrate the point. The Wilt Chamberlain example. Okay, so let's imagine this scenario. Wilt Chamberlain, by the way, was a great basketball player in the 1970s, I think. His career might have stretched into the 80s. I don't remember. Great player. So let's imagine that D1 is your favorite non-entitlement distribution. Now, what does he mean by a non-entitlement distribution? Well, this is the amount of goods that you think everybody ought to have. Now, there's a couple different ways you might imagine that. You might think that people ought to have total equality of goods. That's kind of the simplest non-entitlement distribution. Or you might think that you might take Rawls's kind of distributive principle where people have the amounts such that the least well off are doing better off than they would under any other distribution. That's also a non-entitlement scheme. He says you pick any one of those you want. We'll start with an equality scheme, okay? Or we'll make it look like this. At the beginning of the year, before the NBA season starts, everybody's got, let's say, the same amount of money. This is distributive justice according to some views. Chamberlain's got this amount, Marvin, Martha, Donnie, they've all got the same amount. Okay. Well then, Chamberlain makes an agreement to say that, I'll play basketball as long as I get this cut of everybody's ticket. And the owners agree, okay, yeah, we'll give you this cut of everybody's ticket money. And everybody is like, wants to see Chamberlain play, so they all pony up the ticket prices, and he makes a bunch of money off of everybody's ticket sales by the end of the season. So then you end up with a second distribution. Here's the distribution at the end of the season. Everybody's paid some money to Chamberlain, so he's got he's got a lot more than everybody else. Well, we've messed up the perfect distribution. Things aren't the way they should be anymore. This is how they should be, but by the end of the season, they're totally different. Now, why is it that things got quote-unquote all messed up? Well, Nozick doesn't think that it's messed up at all. He thinks that if you think the original scenario was just, and you think that all the transfers were just, then the end distribution is not unjust. Chamberlain's totally entitled to what he has. Why? He didn't force anybody to come play the games. He didn't force the owners to agree to that particular contract. All of those choices were all voluntary. Everybody was on board and agreed with everything they did. So the outcome could not possibly be unjust. He got his money in a totally fair way. Now, even though we've messed up your beautiful the scheme you thought that everybody should have, here's the moral of the story according to Nozick. Liberty freedom will always upset any quote-unquote ideal distribution of income. No end-state principle or distributional patterned principle of justice can be continuously realized unless you continuously interfere with people's lives to redistribute their goods to match up with the pattern you ought to think that they ought to have. So let's say that you wanted to quote-unquote fix everything after the season and make everybody have the amount that they should. What do you have to do? Redistribute Wilt's wealth. You take all this money that he earned over the season, you give it back to Marvin and Martha and Donnie, and that supposedly makes everything right again. But the only way that you can keep everybody's money equal is by continuously interfering in their lives like this, taking Chamberlain's money and giving it to other people. If you want people to be free and not interfere in their lives, you're going to end up with inequality. Is that unjust? No, not if the inequality resulted from just principles. Everybody was following the rules. They were following the principle of acquisition, following the principle of transfer. Nothing here is unjust, even though it is perhaps very, very unequal. Now, what's Rawls going to say? Rawls is going to say, wait a minute, Donnie would be better off, other people would be better off if we redistribute some of Chamberlain's wealth. Nozick says, better off or not, there's nothing unjust about this distribution. And furthermore, the only way you can achieve your goals, Rawls, is by interfering with people's liberty all the time to make the world match up with your vision of how things ought to be. So that's Nozick's view.